Delegates have gathered in Azerbaijan for the UN's climate conference. Carbon emissions, rising sea levels and melting ice sheets are on the agenda. But will there be an agreement this time? And how will Donald Trump's return to the White House impact the talks? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Leaders from around the world are meeting to address the climate crisis. Azerbaijan's capital Baku is hosting this year's UN COP29 conference, with delegates tackling ways to curb global warming. Scientists warn progress is not on track and inaction could cause irreversible damage to our planet. Funding is also on the agenda. Developing nations need lots of it, up to $1 trillion to help reduce the impact of natural disasters made worse by climate change. But some are questioning if the re-election of Donald Trump, a climate change sceptic, will change plans or even derail agreements. So will politics play a role at this gathering, and how will developing nations level the playing field? We'll put that to our guests in a moment. First, this report from Katia Lopez-Hodoyan.
There's plenty to talk about at this year's United Nations Climate Conference in Azerbaijan's capital. For many countries, the climate crisis is no longer a distant threat. Extreme weather patterns are becoming more common, with devastating consequences. Scientists warn the numbers are undeniable. A rise in global warming is on course to soar past the set limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Climate calamity is the new reality, and we are not keeping up. 2024 is on track to be the hottest year ever recorded, almost 2 months before it ends.
We're going to drill, baby, drill.
Donald Trump's re-election could overshadow the summit. He's a climate change skeptic, and as president, he withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. Now, he's promised to do it again.
I expect a lot of leaders to actually step up and say, and feel the need to clearly distance themselves from the climate denialism that he talks about and projects.
Also on the agenda is funding for developing nations to cope with climate disasters. The price tag could reach $1 trillion.
We understand the political and financial constraints. But let me make 2 points. First, these numbers may sound big, but they are nothing compared to cost of inaction. This investment pay off. And second, we are all in this together.
Leaders from some of the wealthiest countries responsible for much of the world's greenhouse emissions, like the U.S. and China, are notably absent from the conference. Now questions are being raised about the role politics could play at this gathering, as countries work to enhance their commitments to reduce carbon emissions. Katia Lopez-Hodoyan, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, for a deeper sense of what's at stake at COP29, let's welcome our guests. In Baku, Harjeet Singh, Global Engagement Director of the non-profit Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. That's a global campaign to accelerate a transition to renewable energy. In Nairobi, Nazanin Moshidi, Senior Analyst working on climate, environment and conflict in Africa at the International Crisis Group. And also in Baku, Fahad Sai, the climate scientist at the Climate Analytics think tank, who's also advising the chair of the Least Developed Countries Group at COP29. A very warm welcome to each of you. Harjeet, the warnings could not be more stark. What needs to happen at this COP29 to get nations back on track in meeting their climate change goals?
Elizabeth, thank you for having me. The most important issue at COP29 is finance. And I cannot stress enough, since the Paris Agreement and even years before, we have been struggling to get support for developing countries so that they can make a transition away from fossil fuels and protect their people. And as impacts are rising, if they do not get support, people are going to be left on their own. And that's the reality we have in all developing countries. So what we need to see happening at COP29 is a new collective quantified goal, as we call it, that has to be agreed, which should be a new version of what was agreed way back in 2009 and was formalized in 2015 as $100 billion target. But we know we need trillions of dollars annually, and not just that $100 billion, which has not been achieved. Only the claims are being made. So finance is at the very core of COP29 climate talks. And if we fail to achieve the goal of setting this target of trillions annually, we will fail Paris Agreement, and we will also fail people and the planet.
Yeah, that's certainly what we're hearing, that these talks will be focused more on finance than any of the previous COPs. Fahad, the host Azerbaijan, will be tasked with keeping countries focused on agreeing to a new global finance target to replace the current $100 billion a year pledge that does expire this year. But given, as Harjeet said, that pledge has rarely been met, how do you convince developed nations to give more than that?
I think the realization, first of all, thank you for having me in your program. So the realization is more and more that if we have to face this crisis, we need to, we need to have this kind of an arrangement, because we have seen that the $100 billion goal was not sufficient. Not only the amount, but also the quality of the support which was provided, that was not sufficient. So those were like a lot of debt related instruments were issued for the previous goals. So there is an important need to have this kind of $1 trillion, and that is why we are here at this COP. So that is very critical, and I think there is an awareness all across the world that if we need to achieve, because we are in this together as one race, as like humanity. So we need to support, and that is at the very, that is fundamental to the process of UNFCCC, that is recognized. And these 2 weeks are very crucial, as Harjeet put it, and it also depicts from your question as well. So I think that it is very important for the countries to come together, because World Meteorological Organization has published its report today, the state of the climate, and we have seen that today we are 1.3 degrees centigrade warmer than the pre-industrial world. And the kind of impacts the world has seen, those are devastating in this year. So I think we do not have...
Yeah, let me bring Nazanin on there when Fahad speaks about how the world needs to come together. Are we there yet, Nazanin? How far apart are the developed and developing nations? Because while the UN's Environment Programme has said just in the last few days that the world's developing nations need about $1 billion a day just to cope with the extreme weather impacts of today, we have developed nations which are trying to widen the definition of developed nations to include those like China.
Yes, the financing gaps are stark, and they are getting starker by the day. Those figures that you talked about from the UN, here on the African continent, we're looking at Africa needing as much as $2.5 trillion of climate finance by 2030. But funding alone, I would say, isn't enough. I agree with Harjeet, funding is important, but from the negotiators' point of view, I think demanding renewed commitments to the Paris Agreement goals, trying to curb global warming. Look, I mean, Africa contributes a tiny fraction of global carbon emissions, yet suffers disproportionately. And I think that should also be the focus there in Baku. And I'm heading there tonight. And I think it's going to be a very tall order, as you say, for all of these countries to get on the same page with everything that's going on in the world right now.
Yeah, Harjeet, Nazanin is raising a very important point that not all countries have contributed to global emissions in the same way, and not every country has the same resources to combat climate change. Every country needs to act on climate change, but not all at the same pace. Is there an understanding, a real understanding being, and that understanding being applied at Baku?
Well, that's going to be a big question whether we are going to apply that, because that principle very well remains. Starting 1992, when we got the convention, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability, a bit mouthful, but eventually what it means is equity. So countries who have caused the problem are supposed to be taking up much more responsibility and supporting developing countries. What we have been seeing over the last 30 years, Elizabeth, that they have been rather diluting their responsibility. And rich countries are also responsible for increasing their emissions. And I'm totally agreeing with Nazanin that finance is one part, that role developed countries have to play, but they also have to reduce their emissions. But look at where we are. Their emissions have gone up. And if you talk about developed countries, they have plans to increase their fossil fuel extraction between now and 2050. And this is insane, because we know that every barrel of oil is going to add to our misery, to add to the problem of climate crisis that we are facing. Yet they are sticking to the same fossil fuel developing
and
model.
not just
so
sticking to, but we're seeing an acceleration of that from the United States, which is historically the world's largest polluter. Fahad, everyone is worried about the US commitment now to combating climate change after the re-election of Donald Trump. Has that cast a shadow on the conference, given that he pulled out of the Paris Agreement last time he was president, and he's been threatening to roll back the US's carbon cutting commitments?
Yes, so I'm already, I've been in Baku since last week, and we were having the pre-sessionals of the least developed countries group. And during the pre-sessionals, the results started to come of the US election. There was certainly a kind of, uneasiness among the negotiator of the least developed countries. But still, we have seen a similar circumstance in 2016 when Donald Trump came into power, and we have seen that. But at that time, we also came together to address the issue. So let us be optimistic. I'm being optimistic because the kind of issues we face because of climate change, especially in least developed countries, we cannot afford to track back. You're right in saying that there is a certain level of uneasiness among the parties, but that will unfold in the next 2 weeks, and then we'll see that how the negotiation would go, and who's going to take the lead. That'll, yeah.
Yeah, Nazanin, what impact do you think the US, the world's biggest economy, historically the largest polluter, what impact would the US leaving the Paris Agreement again have on global efforts, especially in the least developed nations, many of whom are in Africa?
I mean, I have to say, I'm not as optimistic as your other guest. Trump has dismissed climate change as a hoax. And I feel like there is a very deep level of injustice to much of this because, as we know, the US is not just one of the biggest economies in the world, it's also one of the biggest donor governments in terms of aid systems, which are being stretched not just by climate change, but by multiple conflicts and wars from Gaza, Ukraine, and Sudan here in Africa. And what is potentially going to happen is that it's going probably to fall even more than it already has on poorer parts of the world and large parts of sub-Saharan Africa in particular to deal with these challenges. And I just feel like this is just the injustice of it all. The fact that this will undoubtedly have a huge impact, not just on the climate negotiations, but generally on the conflicts and also the aid that's needed to deal with these conflicts.
And Nazanin, I do want to come back to you about the impact of climate change on conflict and vice versa. But before I do that, Harjeet, the US President Joe Biden is not attending this conference. And in fact, the leaders of the US, China, which is the second biggest polluter, India, which is right up there, and France and Germany are not attending when we know that the US, China, India and the European Union make up well more than 50% of the global greenhouse emissions. Does this say something about their commitment to these talks?
Absolutely, Elizabeth. But before I come to that, if I can add to what Nazanin said, to me, Trump's election is a devastating setback, and it's going to shake the foundations of multilateralism. It's bad news for climate action. It's bad news for global cooperation. It's also bad news for the planet overall. Not because the US has been doing a lot, but we cannot let the biggest historical emitter and the top fossil fuel producer off the hook. And he's going to cause a monumental reversal of clean energy policies that we have seen finally taking shape in the US and having some impact. So all the hard-won gains are going to be eroded, and we'll see more fossil fuel extraction and no climate finance. So we need to understand that the track record of the US over the last 30 years has been extremely bad. And that's where not showing up at this meeting is going to be extremely damaging. So we want world leaders to show up and reiterate their commitment to climate action. And this is the most important COP after the Paris Agreement was achieved in 2015. Because if we don't get an agreement on finance, all the actions that we are seeing being committed by developing countries are not going to be implemented. And it's not just me who is saying. There were two reports a couple of weeks ago, UNEP emissions cap report and the NDC UN synthesis report of all the climate plans that have been submitted. So leaders not showing up. So from developing countries side, I must say, if they are not coming because they are losing trust in this system, because money has not been delivered yet. So, and rich countries not coming because they are not serious about providing money. So we need to really understand why those leaders are not coming to Baku.
Fahad, I want to bring you in here because we are talking about leaders not coming, pledges not being met, and the world on track to well exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2 degrees Celsius warming compared to pre-industrial levels. As a climate scientist at this point, can you just break down for us what's at stake and what each fraction of a degree, the difference that has on the impacts to people and ecosystems?
Yeah, thank you. Before I come to your question, so let me reiterate, and I share the thoughts which were presented by Harjeet and Nazanin, that it is definitely a setback. And as a representative of least developed countries group, we do not have anything else except this forum of UNFCCC. And, and that's why I want to remain positive that the multilateralism Harjeet was talking about, of course, it's a big blow to the multilateralism, but I think that we will find some solutions. So there's more responsibility on the other countries to step up and to fill the space which is left, while realizing that it's a big setback to the process that if US is like, going to turn the table, so that will be
Fahad,
a big
you advise the chair of the group of least developed countries, and when Harjeet talks about how some of the developing nations aren't coming because they've lost trust in the process, what do you say to countries that don't want to participate in the process anymore?
We can show our disappointment, and we need to look at other resources and some out-of-the-box solution, the kind of investment which may come from other countries in renewables and in the transition of energy system. So we definitely need to go for other options, because we cannot. This is a question of of the climate injustice. So the climate injustice is not only across the countries, it is not between developing and developed countries. It is the climate injustice even within the borders. We have seen in Florida what happened in Florida because of the hurricane. It is the poor people, the people who are the lowest decile of the wealth, which were affected. And that's why I want to be optimistic in a sense that the sanity will prevail. If there are gaps, it needs to be filled. So we have to look at this problem of climate crisis from different angles. And you talked about, every degree of, tenth of a degree of warming. Like I said before, that we are at 1.3 degrees centigrade warming above pre-industrial level at the moment, according to the report which is published by WMO today. And at 1.3 degree, we have faced devastating impacts. And least developed countries in Africa, in Asia, in South Asia, they are the ones who are most impacted, according to that report. Again, like Nazneen has mentioned about Africa, least developed countries as a group has contributed less than 1% to the cumulative historical emissions, but they are facing the brunt of it. So I would say we have to stick with the target which we agreed in Global Stocktake decision in Dubai, to cut the emission to achieve the peaking in 2025, reduction in 50% reduction in GHG levels by 2030, and net zero.
I want to bring Nazanin back in on and expand on one of the things you're saying, which is that this needs to be addressed from many angles. And going back to the point that you were making earlier, Nazanin, the conference is taking place at a time when there are wars raging in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan. Is the impact of climate change on conflict and vice versa, is this something that should or is going to be on the agenda?
Well, the negotiators I've spoken to have brought a clear message, I would say, to Baku, that they want climate diplomacy to hold steady amid these global crises that you mentioned, the wars in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, these political shifts in the United States. When you look at the reality on the ground, I don't think anyone is saying that there is a direct link between conflict and climate. But what we are saying is that in many circumstances, it does make things more unstable. And more financing will definitely help mitigate these kinds of threats which are present for peace and stability. And I think that really is the key. But look, funding's not going to prevent these wars, stop the war in any of these places, but it could be the best hope, really, for warding off the most dismal potential outcomes. And I would say it's absolutely a necessity. Just here in Africa, we have, armed conflicts, of course, insurgencies, militant groups that have swept across parts of the continent in the past decade. So investing in resilience can help mitigate some of these ripple effects, I would say, of social tensions, displacement, and even conflict. And also, this could also be a way of trying to sell it to people like Donald Trump, making it clear that it's, in a way, in the interests of the US to be doing something, because the costs of inaction are far more. And being able to adapt to these risks could reduce the risk of, say, mass displacement and potential conflict. And I guess it's up to us, really, to try to sell this now potentially in a different way. It's going to be difficult, but we need to be thinking more innovatively.
Yeah, that is one of the biggest message from climate experts, is the cost of inaction is so much more. Harjeet, is it possible to protect these multilateral negotiations from global turmoil, including, politics in the US?
Well, we need to recognize that, as Fahad also said, this platform is extremely important and precious, because that's where all countries theoretically have same amount of voice and one vote per country. But at the same time, developed countries have made this process so ineffective because of their own vested interests. So it's developed countries who are not meeting their obligations and rather shifting the burden on to developing countries. Look at their historical emissions, talking about the US biggest historical emitter and the top fossil fuel producer now. So it's exacerbating the problem. Europe, a quarter of emissions cumulatively came from Europe. Australia is expanding fossil fuels. So the reality on ground is that rich countries are not trying to address the problem, rather aggravating it. That's what is eroding the trust in the multilateral system. So what we need for them to be accountable and be genuine in their actions and move beyond their vested interests. We are all in this together, as Fahad was saying, and that realization is there. But then when you apply the principle of equity, where developed countries have an outsized responsibility in causing the problem, then they also have to step up and support developing countries through finance and also taking action back home. And I must mention this number because you were talking about wars. The reality is that in the last 2 years, hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent on Ukraine war and money going for war in Gaza. So that money could have been used for climate action. And I'll also make a connection of fossil fuels. And I'll also make a that's a common connection between wars and what we are dealing with, climate crisis here in these halls. And then if you shift money from bad things to good things, we can raise $5 trillion annually by putting a tax on these billionaires. We can really end fossil fuel subsidies. We can tax fossil fuel extraction. And there's a report by Oil Change International which actually calculates if you just reduce the public military spending by 20%, you can raise $450 billion.
There are so many experts suggesting
worldwide
where the money can come from. Fahad, just lastly to you, how do we move on from these conferences just being talk fest to actually seeing pledges being fulfilled and countries back on track to meeting their climate goals?
Yes, and I cannot agree with Harjeet more, but just a point that I also mentioned that now there is a gap. I mean, US pulling out, I mean, we have to go for innovative options, and Harjeet has spelled out a couple of options as well. We should also go for more innovative options. And as a representative of least developed countries, I would also expect bigger economies, also among the developing countries, to show the leadership, because scientifically it is possible to achieve net zero and to achieve Paris Agreement with limited overshoot. But we need political will. We need to intact the multilateralism. And when I said that I was optimistic, I would hope for the other countries, the big economies, to come together and to shield the least developed countries, people, especially the poor in the region. In Africa and other parts of the world against.
All right, we have run out of time, but we will be watching what happens at the conference very closely the next 2 weeks to see what concrete steps come out of it. Thank you to all of our guests, Harjeet Singh in Baku, Nazanin Rashidi in Nairobi, and Fahad Saeed in Baku. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the entire team here, bye for now.